The baby monitor crackled at 2:14 in the morning, and I almost didn't get up to check it, because Josie had been so good with Teddy for 3 weeks straight. So gentle, so patient, that I had finally started sleeping through the small sounds instead of jolting awake at every one of them. But something in the tone of her voice through that little speaker made my whole body go cold before my mind even understood why. And I sat up in bed with my heart already pounding, listening to a woman I had trusted with my son lean over his crib and whisper, "He thinks you are his, but you are mine, you have always been mine, and one day I am going to tell you everything." I did not move for almost 10 full seconds. I sat there in the dark, my husband Bennett asleep beside me with his mouth slightly open, snoring the untroubled snore of a man who believed his world was exactly as solid as he had built it to look. And I listened to the monitor as Josie hummed something low and unfamiliar to my 6-week-old son. A tune that was not a lullaby I recognized, not something from any of the baby books stacked on our nursery shelf. I got out of bed without waking Bennett. I walked down the hallway of our house in Brookhaven, Georgia, past the framed ultrasound photos Prudence Sinclair had insisted on hanging like trophies, past the nursery door that Josie always kept cracked exactly 4 inches, and I stood outside it in the dark, barefoot on the cold hardwood, listening to my son's Nanny whisper secrets to a baby who could not yet understand a single word she was saying, but who I would spend the rest of that night, and many nights after, desperately trying to protect. That was the night everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my son, and my own body started to come apart, one thread at a time, until there was nothing left holding the picture together at all. My name is Delphine Acaffer Sinclair, and 6 months before that night, I believed I was the luckiest woman I knew. I had married into the Sinclair family 2 years earlier, a family that had built its fortune on Sinclair Biogenetics, one of the most respected fertility and reproductive science institutes on the East Coast, a company founded by my mother-in-law, Prudence Sinclair, back when fertility treatment was still something people whispered about instead of something they posted on social media with pastel announcement graphics. Bennett was the only son, the heir apparent, a man with an easy laugh and a way of making a room feel calmer just by walking into it. And when he proposed to me on a rooftop in Savannah with the kind of ring that made my sister gasp audibly, I remember thinking that my life had clicked into place exactly the way it was supposed to. What people did not see, what I did not let them see, was the 2 years before that proposal when Bennett and I had quietly, privately, tried and failed to have a child on our own, month after month of hope curdling into disappointment, until Prudence finally sat us both down in her glass-walled office at Sinclair Biogenetics and told us, in that clipped, clinical voice she used for everything, that we would be undergoing IVF at her clinic, using her doctors under her supervision. Because, as she put it, there is no reason a Sinclair should struggle with something we have spent 30 years solving for other people. I remember feeling grateful in that moment, actually grateful, because I did not yet understand that gratitude, in that family, always came with strings attached so fine you could not see them until they had already wrapped around your throat. The IVF process was harder than anyone had warned me it would be. The injections, the bloating, the mood swings that made me cry over dish soap commercials. The 2 failed transfers that Prudence referred to as data points instead of losses. And by the time we reached our 3rd attempt, I was so exhausted, so desperate for it to finally work, that I signed whatever paperwork the clinic put in front of me without reading every line, because I trusted them, because they were family. Because Prudence had built her entire life's work on making sure women like me did not have to suffer the way her own mother once had trying to conceive. When the 3rd transfer worked, when I saw 2 lines on that test for the first time in my life, I cried so hard that Bennett thought something was wrong, and I remember him holding my face in both his hands and saying, "This is our miracle, Delphine. This is everything we wanted." And I believed him completely. Theodore Bennett Sinclair was born on a Tuesday in March, 7 pounds 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair that made the delivery nurse laugh and say he looked like he was already ready for his first job interview. And when they placed him on my chest, slippery and furious and perfect, I forgot every single injection, every disappointment, every moment of doubt, because none of it mattered anymore, Beck. Oz, he was here. I want to be honest and say that the first few weeks were beautiful in the way that new motherhood is beautiful. which is to say exhausting and overwhelming, and stitched together with more love than I had ever felt for another human being in my life. But they were also hard, harder than anyone prepares you for, and by week 4 I was running on fumes. And Bennett was back at Sinclair Biogenetics 12 hours a day, because Prudence did not believe in paternity leave any more than she believed in taking weekends off. And my own mother lived 4 states away and could only stay for 10 days before she had to return to her own job. That was when Prudence suggested a night nanny, and I remember being surprised, because Prudence Sinclair did not typically suggest things. She typically arranged them and then informed you they had already been arranged. And within a week, a woman named Josie Renner was sitting across from me at our kitchen table with a folder of references so polished I barely skimmed them. Josie was somewhere in her mid-30s, soft-spoken, with reddish-brown hair she kept twisted into a low knot and pale gray eyes that had a way of looking at you a beat too long before she answered a question. And she had a certification from a well-regarded infant care program, 3 glowing references from families in Atlanta, and a calm, unhurried way of holding Teddy the very first time she picked him up that made something in my chest unclench for the first time in weeks. I remember thinking, watching her that first night as she swayed gently with my son in the nursery, singing something low under her breath, that I had never seen a stranger hold a baby with such immediate, instinctive tenderness. And at the time, I mistook that tenderness for professional skill. For the first 2 weeks, everything was exactly as good as it looked on paper. Josie arrived at 9 each night and left at 7 each morning. She kept meticulous notes on feeding times and diaper changes. She never once raised her voice, never once seemed impatient, and I slept more soundly than I had since Teddy was born, grateful in a way that made me defend her instantly when my sister Yvonne, visiting for a weekend, said something felt a little off about the way Josie looked at the baby. Off how? I had asked, more sharply than I meant to, and Yvonne had just shrugged and said, I don't know, Dell, she looks at him like she's grieving something. And I had brushed it off as my sister being overprotective, the way she always was, because Yvonne had never trusted anyone easily, not even people who deserved it. It was small things at first, things I noticed but did not name, the way Josie would sometimes go quiet mid-sentence when I walked into the nursery, the way she kept a small silver locket pinned inside her cardigan that she would touch whenever she thought no one was looking, the way she once referred to Teddy, just once, as my sweet boy before quickly correcting herself to your sweet boy with a laugh that came half a second too late. I told myself I was being paranoid, that new mothers were famous for irrational anxieties, that some parenting forum I had scrolled through at 3 in the morning had probably planted the idea that nannies were secretly dangerous. And I pushed the discomfort down the same way I had pushed down every other doubt in my marriage, because doubting things was exhausting, and I was already so tired. Then came the night with the monitor. After I stood outside that cracked nursery door and heard Josie whisper that Teddy was hers, that he had always been hers, I did not confront her that night, because my hands were shaking too hard to trust myself to speak calmly, and because some instinct, some old survival instinct I did not know I had, told me that whatever this was, I needed proof before I said a single word. I went back to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, staring at Bennett's sleeping face, and for the first time in our marriage, I looked at my husband and felt something closer to suspicion than love. The next morning, after Josie left for the day, I did something I had never done before in my life. I searched her name, her full legal name from her employment paperwork, Josephine Marie Renner, and found almost nothing, no social media, no public records beyond a driver's license address that traced back to an apartment complex in Macon, and a name that did not match a single one of the 3 glowing references she had provided. Because when I called the numbers listed on those references, one was disconnected, one belonged to a dry cleaning business, and the third rang through to a woman who had no idea who Josie Renner was. My stomach dropped somewhere around the second phone call and did not come back up for the rest of that day. I did not tell Bennett right away, because some cautious part of me wanted to understand what I was dealing with before I handed him the chance to explain it away, the way he had explained away so many small things over our marriage, the late nights, the sudden trips to see his mother that never seemed to have an agenda, the way Prudence always seemed to know things about our life before I had told anyone. Instead, I called my sister Yvonne, and I told her everything, the whisper on the monitor, the fake references, the strange things she had noticed weeks earlier that I had dismissed. And Yvonne, to her credit, did not say a single "I told you so." She simply said, "Delphine, you need to get a real investigator today, not tomorrow, today," and gave me the number of a woman named Corinne Delacroix, a private investigator she had used once during a messy business dispute. Corinne was blunt in a way I found strangely comforting, a woman in her 50s with a smoker's voice and no patience for hand-wringing. And when I told her the story over the phone, she asked only one question before agreeing to take the case. "Does this family own a fertility clinic?" she asked, and when I said yes, she went quiet for a moment and then said, "All right, Mrs. Sinclair, I think I might already have an idea what we're dealing with, but I need 48 hours to be sure before I say anything that might not be true." Those 48 hours were the longest of my life, because I had to keep functioning as though nothing was wrong, feeding my son, smiling at Josie when she arrived each evening, sitting across the dinner table from Bennett and asking him about his day as though my entire understanding of our family had not just cracked down the middle. On the second night, unable to sleep, I did something I am not proud of. I went into Bennett's home office while he showered and opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he always kept locked except when he thought no one was paying attention, and inside I found a manila folder with the Sinclair Biogenetics letterhead, containing consent forms, donor intake paperwork, and a name I did not recognize typed neatly at the top of the first page, Renata Kessler. I sat on the floor of his office with that folder in my lap and read every page twice. And by the time I finished, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper steady, because what I was looking at was a donor egg agreement, dated 11 months before Teddy was born, listing Renata Kessler as an anonymous donor whose genetic material had been used in an IVF cycle for patient D. Sinclair, my own name, on a form I had never seen, never signed, and never once been told existed. I heard the shower shut off down the hall, and I quietly slid the folder back exactly where I had found it, closed the drawer, and walked out of that office feeling like a stranger in my own house. The next afternoon, Corinne called me with the confirmation I had already, in my gut, known was coming, that Josephine Renner and Renata Kessler were the same woman, that she had legally changed portions of her identity documentation 2 years earlier after a difficult divorce, and that 11 months before my son was born, Renata Kessler had donated eggs at Sinclair Biogenetics under a confidentiality agreement that guaranteed her anonymity. An agreement that had apparently been violated by someone inside that very clinic who gave her access to information she should never have had, including, eventually, my home address and my need for a night nanny. I asked Corinne the only question that mattered to me in that moment, whether Teddy was biologically mine, and she was gentle but direct, telling me that based on the paperwork, it was extremely likely that the embryo transferred into me during that third cycle had used a donor egg, meaning that genetically, my son might not share my DNA at all, something only a paternity and maternity test could confirm for certain. I remember sitting on my kitchen floor after that call, my back against the cabinets, staring at the small pile of burp cloths I had left drying on the counter, and feeling a grief so specific and so strange that I did not have a name for it, because I was not grieving my son. I loved him exactly as much in that moment as I had every moment before it. I was grieving the story I had believed about how he came to exist, and grieving the realization that my husband and his mother had apparently decided together that I did not need to know the truth about my own body and my own child. When Bennett came home that evening, I was waiting for him at the kitchen table with the folder from his office drawer sitting in front of me, and I watched every trace of color drain out of his face the moment he saw it. "Delphine," he started, and I held up my hand, because I did not want the version of this conversation where he tried to soften it before I had even asked my questions. "Did you know," I asked him, "that the embryo transferred into me was not made with my eggs?" He did not answer right away, which was, in itself, an answer, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out smaller than I had ever heard it. "The second cycle failed because your eggs weren't viable, Delphine," the doctors told my mother, and she made the call to use a donor without telling either of us the full details until after it worked. She said it would only cause you more pain to know that once it worked, it wouldn't matter. I asked him the next question, even though some part of me already knew I would not like the answer. Did you know the donor was working in our house? His silence lasted long enough that I stood up from the table before he answered, because I did not need him to say it out loud. I could see it written across his face. The slow, sick understanding that he had known, or at the very least suspected, and had said nothing, because saying something would have meant admitting to me that the woman rocking our son to sleep every night was the woman whose genetic material had made that possible. And that his mother had orchestrated the entire arrangement without my consent because she believed, in her own twisted, controlling way, that keeping the donor close would let the clinic monitor the outcome of what she referred to, according to the paperwork, as Case 114. Not my son, Case 114. I did not scream that night, though some part of me wanted to. I simply walked upstairs, packed a bag for myself and Teddy, and drove to my sister's house 40 minutes away, and Bennett did not follow me, because for once in his life, he seemed to understand there was nothing he could say that would make me stay. Over the next several days, staying in Yvonne's guest room with Teddy sleeping in a portable crib beside my bed, I learned the rest of the story piece by piece, partly from Corinne's continued investigation, and partly from a phone call I never expected to receive, from Renata Kessler herself. She called me on a Thursday afternoon, and I almost did not answer, but something told me I needed to hear whatever she had to say, if only to finally understand the shape of what had happened to my family. I know you probably hate me, she said, her voice thin and careful, the same voice I had heard through that baby monitor whispering secrets into my son's crib, and you have every right to, but I need you to know that I did not ask for any of this to happen the way it did. She told me that 2 years earlier, drowning in debt after her divorce, she had donated her eggs at Sinclair Biogenetics for compensation, under a strict anonymity agreement that both parties, donor and recipient, were never supposed to identify each other, and that everything had gone according to that agreement until roughly 8 months ago, when a woman she described only as someone high up at the clinic contacted her privately and offered her an enormous sum of money to take a temporary nannying position with a family whose child had been conceived using her donation, framed to Renata as an opportunity to help the family adjust during a difficult postpartum period. She told me the mother was struggling, that the family needed someone experienced who already understood the medical history, Renata said, and I told myself it was just a job. I told myself I could do it and not let it mean anything. But the moment I held him, Delphine, the moment I held Teddy, I understood I had made a terrible mistake taking that job, because he felt like mine in a way I was not prepared for, and once I felt that, I could not make myself stop feeling it. I asked her the name of the woman who had recruited her, already suspecting the answer, and she confirmed it without hesitation. Prudence Sinclair. I sat with that confirmation for a long time after we hung up, turning it over in my mind, and the picture that finally emerged was uglier than anything I had imagined standing outside that nursery door 2 weeks earlier. Prudence had not simply arranged a donor egg without my consent. She had then, months later, deliberately identified and recruited that same donor into our household, violating both the anonymity agreement and basic medical ethics, apparently because she wanted, in her own words according to Renata, to monitor the genetic outcome in a controlled environment, treating my son and the woman who had donated the egg to create him as an ongoing experiment rather than as human beings with a right to make their own choices about their own lives. When I finally sat down with Corinne to review everything she had gathered, the scope of it was staggering, because Renata was not the only donor Prudence had done this to. Corinne's investigation uncovered records suggesting at least 2 other families connected to Sinclair Biogenetics, where similar unauthorized substitutions and undisclosed monitoring arrangements had taken place over the past 6 years, all buried under non-disclosure agreements and consulting contracts designed to look on paper like routine clinic business. I remember asking Corinne, my voice flat with disbelief, how something like this could have gone on for years without anyone noticing, and she looked at me with something close to pity and said, "Mrs. Sinclair, people rarely look closely at systems that are already working in their favor, and everyone around Prudence Sinclair had a reason not to look too closely." That was when I understood that this was no longer only about my marriage, or my son, or even about me. This was about a woman who had spent 30 years building an institution that thousands of desperate, hopeful families trusted with the most vulnerable moments of their lives, and who had quietly, methodically, been treating some of those families as raw material for her own curiosity and control. I hired a different attorney than the one Bennett's family normally used, a sharp, unflinching woman named Odette Marchand who specialized in medical malpractice and reproductive law. And together, we began building a case that would eventually reach far beyond my own kitchen table. The first step was the DNA test, which Odette insisted on doing properly, through an accredited lab, with both Renata and myself submitting samples alongside Teddy's. And I will admit that waiting those 5 business days for results was one of the hardest stretches of my entire life, because no matter what the paper said, I already knew in my heart that I was Teddy's mother, that carrying him, birthing him, and loving him every single day since made me exactly as much his mother as any strand of DNA ever could. But I also needed, for legal reasons Odette explained carefully, to understand exactly what we were dealing with before we moved forward. The results confirmed what the clinic paperwork had already suggested, that Renata Kessler was Teddy's biological genetic mother, and that I had carried and delivered a child who was not genetically my own. A reality that Odette told me, gently, gave Renata certain legal standing I needed to understand and account for, even though Renata herself, to my genuine surprise, made it clear from our very first conversation that she had no intention of pursuing any custody claim. "I don't want to take him from you," Renata told me during our second phone call, her voice cracking. "I want you to understand that I never wanted that. I just wanted, I wanted to know him a little. I wanted to make sure he was loved. And once I saw that he was, once I saw how you looked at him in the pictures Prudence showed me to convince me to take the job, I think I just could not make myself walk away without at least saying something to him, even if he couldn't understand it yet." I believed her, not immediately, and not without reservation. But over the following weeks, as the legal process unfolded, and as Corinne's investigation into Sinclair biogenetics widened, I came to see Renata not as a villain in my story, but as another woman Prudence Sinclair had manipulated and used, financially desperate, emotionally isolated after her divorce. And easy prey for a woman who had built an entire company on understanding exactly how to exploit people's deepest hopes and fears about family. The confrontation with Prudence happened 3 weeks after that first night with the monitor, in the same glass-walled office where she had once told Bennett and me that IVF was simply a problem she would solve for us. And this time, I did not sit quietly across from her desk waiting to be managed. I brought Odette with me and a folder of my own containing copies of everything Corinne had gathered, and I watched Prudence Sinclair's carefully composed expression falter, just slightly, when I laid the donor consent form on her desk and asked her to explain, in her own words, why my name was on paperwork I had never signed. "I did what was necessary," she said, her voice as clipped and controlled as ever, though her hands, I noticed, were gripping the edge of her desk a little too tightly. "Your eggs were not viable, Delphine. I was not going to watch my son's marriage fall apart over a biological technicality. I made a decision that gave you a healthy grandchild and gave this family an heir, and I would make that decision again." "You forged consent," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. "You put a stranger in my house without telling me who she was. You treated my son like a research file." Prudence's jaw tightened. "I protected this family." "You violated me," I said. "And you violated Renata, and I am fairly certain, based on what my investigator has found, that you have done this to other families as well. And I intend to make sure every single one of them finds out exactly what you did." That was the moment Prudence Sinclair, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, had absolutely nothing to say. The following months moved with a strange, exhausting momentum, because once, Odette formally filed the complaint against Sinclair Biogenetics with the state medical board, And once Corinne's findings about the other affected families became part of the official record, the story could no longer be contained inside our family. And within 6 weeks, a local investigative journalist named Priya Chandrasekharan picked up the case. And within 6 weeks after that, it was no longer a local story at all. Bennett, to his credit, did not try to defend his mother once the full scope of what she had done became clear, though it took him far too long, in my opinion, to understand that his own silence about the donor arrangement, even if he had not orchestrated it himself, made him complicit in a betrayal every bit as damaging as hers. "I should have told you the moment I found out," he said to me one evening, sitting across from me at Yvonne's kitchen table, because I still had not moved back into our house by then and was not sure at that point whether I ever would. "I told myself I was protecting you, but I think really I was just protecting myself from having to watch your face when you found out what my mother had done." I did not forgive him that night, and I want to be honest that I have still, even now, not fully forgiven him. But I did eventually come to understand that there was a difference between the damage his mother had deliberately, calculatedly caused, and the damage his cowardice had caused, and while both hurt me deeply, only one of them convinced me I could never trust him with anything important again. We separated formally 4 months after that night with the baby monitor. And the divorce, unlike the one I had once imagined for other people's messy lives, was almost entirely uncontested. Because Bennett, whatever else he was, loved Teddy enough to agree to a custody arrangement that protected our son first. And because the mounting legal and public pressure on the Sinclair family left him with neither the energy nor the credibility to fight me on anything. Sinclair Biogenetics did not survive the scandal in its original form. The state medical board suspended its fertility licensing pending a full investigation. 3 of Prudence's senior staff were terminated, and 2 were later indicted on charges related to falsified consent documentation, and Prudence herself, after months of legal proceedings, agreed to a settlement that included permanently surrendering her medical license and paying substantial restitution to every family Corinne's investigation had identified, including a fund specifically established for Renata and the 2 other donors whose lives had been quietly rearranged without their full understanding of what they were agreeing to. I want to say the story ends there, neatly, with the villain punished and the good people rewarded, but real life rarely closes that cleanly. And the truth is that even a year later, I still catch myself sometimes staring at Teddy while he sleeps, searching his face for pieces of Renata, pieces of myself, pieces of a story that will always be more complicated than either of us imagined the day he was born. Renata and I did not become friends, not exactly, but we built something over that year that I would describe as careful, respectful distance with occasional bridges. She sends a card on his birthday. I send her photographs twice a year, and once, when Teddy was old enough to ask about the nice lady who used to sing to him, I told him the simple, true version of the story, that a kind woman had helped bring him into the world, and that both of us loved him very much. And he accepted that the way small children accept most complicated truths, with a shrug and a request for more crackers. I moved into a smaller house in Decatur with Teddy, closer to Yvonne, closer to the life I actually wanted rather than the one I had inherited by marrying into it, and I went back to work part-time as a pediatric occupational therapist, a career I had quietly set aside when Prudence decided a Sinclair wife's job was simply to be a Sinclair wife. People sometimes ask me, when they hear pieces of this story, whether I regret marrying Bennett, whether I wish I had never set foot inside that glass-walled office where his mother first offered to solve our fertility struggles. And the honest answer is more complicated than regret, because that marriage, for all its damage, gave me my son, and I have never once, not for a single second, regretted him. What I regret is how long I let other people with more confidence and more money and more practiced authority than me, convince me that their decisions about my own body and my own family were somehow more valid than my right to simply be told the truth. Peace did not arrive the day Prudence Sinclair lost her medical license, and it did not arrive the day my divorce was finalized. It arrived slowly, in small, unremarkable moments, the first night I put Teddy to bed in our new house, and realized I was not listening for anything through the monitor except his ordinary, peaceful breathing, The first morning I woke up in a house that belonged entirely to me. The first time I looked at my son's face and felt nothing but simple, uncomplicated love, unclouded by fear of what I might not yet know. Some people, when they hear this story, ask what I would have done if Josie, if Renata, had never whispered those words into that monitor. If I had simply gone on believing the story I was given. And I have thought about that question more than I care to admit, because the honest answer is that I do not know. And that uncertainty used to frighten me more than almost anything else about this entire experience. But I have come to believe that the truth, however painful, however inconvenient for the people who would rather I never learned it, was always mine to know. And that no fortune, no family name, no glass-walled office full of framed accomplishments gives anyone the right to decide what a mother is allowed to understand about her own child. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you had been standing outside that nursery door listening to those words through the monitor? Would you have confronted her immediately or waited for proof the way I did? Share your perspective in the comments. And if you enjoy real stories about family secrets, betrayal, and the strength it takes to rebuild a life on your own terms, please consider subscribing and joining us for the next story.